During the Tudor period, there were thousands of executions which were carried out across England. Henry VIII executed some of his closest friends, such as Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More, and these both lost their heads on Tower Hill. To disagree or go against the king or the queen was very dangerous, and one of the most serious things a woman could be accused of was witchcraft. Throughout the centuries, hundreds of women were executed, being considered to have been witches, but there was one woman who dared to tell Henry VIII not to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth Barton, or the Nun of Kent, was considered a brave lady, but to tell the king how to live his life was not acceptable. Neither was prophesying or predicting the death of the king. She was ultimately found guilty of treason and was sentenced to a brutal death. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Nun of Kent, Elizabeth Barton, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Elizabeth Barton's early life isn't well documented, but she was born around 1506. She wasn't well off or rich, and it's most probable that she did not receive a good standard of education, and we must assume that she could not read or write. But she worked as a servant in the household of a man named Thomas Cobb, who worked for Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham as his farm manager in a local village 20 miles away from Canterbury. But in 1535, Elizabeth became ill, and it was said that she was touched with a great infirmity in her body, which did ascend at divers times up into her throat, which swelled greatly, during which she seemed to be in grievous pain, insomuch as a man would have thought that she had suffered the pangs of death itself, until the disease descended and fell down into the body again. She was prone to illness, but when she became sick, she began to predict events and indulge in bizarre behaviour. During one episode, she predicted the death of a sick child, and she meddled with predictions, and a number believed that she was touched by God to warn the people on earth. In reality, she was most probably suffering from seizures, and possibly epilepsy, which caused her body and face to spasm and contort, and she would briefly suffer from paralysis. But she predicted many things about religion, hammering home her Catholic beliefs. She became a tourist attraction in a sense, and people would come from all over to see Elizabeth Barton's visions and ideas, and even Thomas Cranmer came to visit, and he claimed he had witnessed a miracle. He saw Elizabeth in a trance for 3 hours, and then in this she spoke of heaven, and also warned of hell. But Cranmer must have thought that she was witnessing the afterlife in these episodes, and she became known as the Nun of Kent. But Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham and John Fisher were also impressed, and they arranged for her to try and meet Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's most senior advisor. But during this meeting, Elizabeth Barton told Wolsey that she saw him with 3 swords, representing the power he had from the Pope, and the power he had as Lord Chancellor, and the final sword showed the power he had to get Henry VIII his divorce from his first wife. But Wolsey then sorted out a meeting for Elizabeth to meet with Henry VIII, and during this meeting she went fully on the offensive. She told the king to burn all of his English translations of the Bible, and to back the Pope in the Catholic Church. She said, however, if he married his second wife Anne Boleyn, then within a month of the marriage taking place, the king would be dead. She followed this up, saying that England would then be hit by a devastating plague that would kill thousands. Henry was shocked, and he told his friends to keep a close eye on her. Many others saw her as a symbol of the devil, and warned that her visions were a work of an evil being. Ultimately, by predicting the death of the king if he married his second wife, Elizabeth Barton had committed treason, as she could have been seen as wishing this to happen. She went on tour up and down the country, addressing large groups of people. People asked her to cure them of illnesses and diseases, and to speak to God for them. She ultimately was a Catholic purist, and warned against the Protestant Church. But she met the king again in October 1532, and during this she said how God hated what the king was doing, and she yet again told Henry VIII that he was going to die if he went ahead with the marriage to Anne Boleyn, and that he would be damned to hell. But Anne Boleyn at the time was already pregnant, and the king decided he had no choice but to marry her, and he quickly pushed through an annulment with his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But Elizabeth Barton had attracted a large amount of criticism from other members of the church, who told her to hold back a little bit on her criticism of the king. Many believed that she could have been executed for her predictions, but she did not hold fire, and instead wrote a book. Cromwell discovered this, and he ordered all copies to be burned, but then Thomas Cranmer brought her in for questioning. She was later released, but was then again questioned by Thomas Cromwell, and she and her book publisher were arrested. In November 1533, Elizabeth Barton found herself locked up inside of the Tower of London, and being interrogated daily by Cromwell and Cranmer. Cromwell stated to the king that Elizabeth had never had any visions, and that she in fact had made these predictions up for fun from her imagination. She may have suffered torture and been placed on the rack to draw a confession. But on the 23rd of November 1533, she was publicly humiliated and was forced to confess what she had done, and what she had said was in fact a lie. She was forced to recant this confession in many different towns, and Henry VIII saw her as a threat. But then he passed a law in which charged Elizabeth Barton and her co-conspirators with treason for predicting the king's death, and this bill was passed, and Elizabeth Barton was sentenced to be executed. She was taken from the Tower of London to Tyburn, where triangular gallows stood that took the lives of thousands. She spoke to the scaffold and said, "I have not only been the cause of my own death, which most justly I have deserved, but also I am the cause of deaths of all these persons, which at the time here suffer. To say the truth, I am not so blamed, considering it was well known until these learned men that I was a poor wench without learning, and therefore they might have easily perceived that the things were done by me could not proceed in such short, but their capabilities and learning could right well judge from whence they proceeded. But because the things which I feigned was profitable unto them, therefore they much praised me, and that it was the Holy Ghost that I did them. And then I, being puffed up with their praises, feel a certain pride and foolish fantasy with myself." She admitted she was a fraud, but her execution was barbaric. On the gallows the executioner approached her. He placed a rope around her neck, and then hanged her from the Tyburn gallows. She wasn't just hanged though, she also was the only woman to have had her head placed on London Bridge, as the executioner then pulled out his axe and took her head clean off. But Elizabeth Barton was a woman who ultimately predicted the death of Tudor England's most notorious king, and for this the king deemed it right for her to die. She was probably a woman who was taken advantage of by a number of men who saw her as a way to make money. They saw that the crowds would flock to see her, and that through her they would ask for God's help. But ultimately this resulted in a number of men getting quite rich at the expense of Elizabeth Barton, who was probably suffering from a disease or illness such as epilepsy. Her story is one which is very tragic and has a very brutal end to it. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.